So in the previous screencast we discussed square roots and cube roots and the symbols involved and how to evaluate those. Now we're going to talk about estimating square roots and cube roots when you're not given a calculator. For instance, what if I asked you, what is the square root of 180? Well, you'll probably note pretty quickly that 180 is not a perfect square. If you know your perfect squares pretty well, you know that 180 is not one of those on your list. So, given that information, how can we estimate what the square root of 180 is? Well, the first thing that I would do is I'd write down some of your square roots that are close to 180, that you know that are perfect squares. For instance, we know that the square root of 144 is equal to 12. 12 times 12 would give us 144. And if you have any trouble with that, go back and watch the other screencast. Now, for instance, what's another perfect square result? Well, we know that the square root of 169 is 13. We know that 13 times 13 is 169. And that's getting pretty close to our 180 here as our radicand. So, ask yourself, well, what's my next perfect square? Well, the next perfect square result that we have is 196. What's the square root of 196? Well, that's 14. 14 times 14 is 196. And note, 180, this radicand here, falls between 169 and 196. So if you were forced to estimate what the square root of 180 is, well, you can say that essentially the square root of 180, well, it's going to be greater than the square root of 169. 180 is larger than 169. But you know it's going to be less than the square root of 196. And we know what the square root of 169 is. Let me go ahead and write that down. We know that that's 13. We don't yet know what the square root of 180 is. But we do know what the square root of 196 is, and we know that that's 14. So if forced to estimate, you don't have a calculator, we know pretty easily that the square root of 180 is between 13 and 14. So that does it for estimating a square root. Now what about cube roots? What if I asked you, for instance, what is the cube root of 650? Now pretty quickly, once we start studying our cube roots and our cubes, we'll note that 650 is not one of our perfect cubes. For instance, 6 cubed is 6 times 6 times 6, which is 216. Going up 1, adding 1 to our base, 7 cubed, well, that's 343. Adding 1 to our base again, 8 cubed, well, that's going to get us 512. 9 cubed, and notice 8 cubed, 512, we're getting closer to 650. Turns out 9 cubed, 9 times 9 times 9, that gives us 729. Well, note that 650 is between 512 and 729. So, quickly, we can write the cubed root of 650 must be between these two cubed roots. The cubed root of 512. Note 650 is greater than 512, so the cube root of 650 is going to be greater than 512. But yet, we know that 650 is less than 729. Therefore, the cubed root of 650 will be less than the cubed root of 729. And now let's go ahead and insert these cubes. We know the cubed root of 512 is 8, because 8 cubed is 512. And we'll go ahead and insert the cubed root of 650. And we know that 729 is a perfect cube. The cubed root of 729, well, that's 9. So we know 650, the cubed root of 650, is between 8 and 9. Now later on we'll talk about how to get a greater approximation, but for right now that'll do it for this screencast.